Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our first post-COVID, well, we may not be completely post-COVID, but our first in-person spotlight interview that I'm very happy to be doing here from the World AIDS Museum itself. My name is Andy Ruffner. I'm the Director of Education and Programming for the museum, and I'm here today with Parvir Aujla, who is a medical student at Nova Southeastern University here in South Florida, and we're in front of the Intersections Living with HIV in the Times of COVID-19 exhibit, which has been up here at the museum for many months now and is coming to a close to make way for a new exhibit in the space. And going to talk with Parvir about his amazing work on this and how that's been here at the museum. So, welcome.
Thanks for having me, Andy. Excited.
It's great. It's great for you to be able to be here. So this is a rarity, folks. This is a fourth-year medical student with a little time on his hands to be able to come out and see us and have this conversation. So what we usually do in the spotlight interview is the first question that we always lead off with is this question about, for you, what was your earliest memory of hearing about or knowing something about HIV or AIDS? Like, what do you remember about that?
I think the oldest memory, I was trying to think about this before we started. I grew up in right outside of San Francisco,
Mm-hmm.
and there was a very strong community of, LGBTQ at that time. And I think just having friends that were, that identified in that way, just hearing the stories and I guess the stigma around HIV was probably the first thing I learned about, especially just in like hookup culture.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that was like I didn't really know much about HIV at that time.
Mm-hmm.
And when I had this conversation with like my friends, they told me like, oh yeah, like, when you're out, like this is something you should be looking for. And I was like, what is this? Like, and they kind of like started explaining more and more. But at that time, I still didn't know too much.
Mm-hmm.
And from a more pharmaceutical side, my mom is a chemist, and I think she worked on a few drugs or like helped, other companies like create some of them. So I knew from that side as well.
Mm-hmm. Wow. So I didn't think about the idea about growing up in San Francisco and being so near a huge epicenter.
Yeah.
Kind of around that. So as you're describing that, I'm picturing that you're probably talking about your teen into college years, maybe?
Yeah. So this was probably like in my like sophomore, junior year of high school. And then just moving into college is like when I actually started understanding more of like what HIV is as a disease,
Mm-hmm.
and how it works and how it affects the body and how it can like transition into AIDS eventually.
Mm-hmm.
So I think, majoring into science kind of included me into that side.
Mm-hmm.
But I think as just like, a college student, high school student, it was more just known like amongst like the, people I surrounded myself with, and that like, hey, this is like something that you should be like looking out for, as well as like, chlamydia, gonorrhea, and things
Mm-hmm.
like that.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think that I hear a lot about that. We do a lot of prevention education work out in schools, and so I feel really strongly that we have to start out talking about gonorrhea, chlamydia, and then syphilis
Mm-hmm.
before we get to AIDS, because number one, that's usually the starter thing that happens. And so a lot of times, interestingly from public health, if we have a syphilis outbreak
Mm-hmm.
in a community, a lot of times there's an echo of HIV later on, like a year later. So if you have a big syphilis spike, a lot of times it will be followed by an HIV spike a year later.
Interesting.
From that. So I think it's kind of an interesting thing to consider in that.
Yeah.
So tell us about this project. So this was an interesting thing. We were actually in our other building over in Wilton Station when you initially contacted me, and tell me about how this came about for you, that you got the idea to do this project.
Yeah, so I think at this point, like, my medical school had gone remote, and I was taking classes from home, and I was going a little stir crazy like everyone else during the pandemic,
Mm-hmm.
working your way through Tiger King and other documentaries to trying a bunch of new hobbies. And I've always been a photographer, and that's something I've always enjoyed doing. just because it lets me connect with people in a way that's, you know, more intimate, but also to allow to like create like an art form. And my partner had come to the museum with her organization and had met you, Andy. And we were just trying to think of ideas of like, you know, how can I connect my passion for photography with medicine, and how do I like highlight issues in our society that, you know, are important for the medical community as well as for like the rest of the world to know, instead of like making pamphlets, right? And I think this is a time that's like where, you know, documentaries are becoming more and more interesting and engaging. So I kind of wanted to take that approach with medicine and use my photography as a way to channel that. And at the same time, I came across a couple of articles that were comparing the HIV pandemic to the COVID-19 pandemic. And so I just kind of got the ball rolling, and I didn't know what I was going to actually discover when I got to talk to a lot of the people that participated in this project and what they had to say. But just a lot about how it was being handled in the beginning, the stigma around it, that when if you were COVID positive or HIV positive, how society first looked at you when the virus had first come into like the spotlight with like the news medias and everything. So yeah, I just was like, maybe there's something here. And I got in contact with Andy and chatted with him, and, you know, you saw the same potential that, you know, you've kind of heard similar chatter amongst the HIV community. So we thought, you know, let's start with just one person, one brave volunteer who's open about putting their name out there as well as their status, which is a very big thing to ask, and see where this goes. And we made this question list, and you know, we got it approved by you guys, made sure that we were kind of hitting this important topics that we wanted to get into, and started there.
Yeah, I mean, it really did resonate with what I was hearing from a lot of different people. I have a good friend who's HIV positive, and he was got COVID and had a contact tracing call from the health department where the person that was doing the contact tracing really just sort of hounded him about, well, where were you? You know, where are the places that you've been? How do you think you got this? And this whole like sort of process. And I think one of the things he said for him was that it was really re-traumatizing of,
definitely.
You know, the experience of when, and he had found out that he was HIV positive back in like 1989. So this is a long time ago. But it brought it all back of getting these questions about, you know, who were you with? Who did you see? How do you think this happened? And this sort of underlying thing of you did something wrong.
Yes.
And now you're sick. So yeah, that was kind of a rough thing with that. So we got the connections made, and some of the photography you actually did here in the park. If you're not familiar with where we are, we're in a beautiful Fort Lauderdale city park called Holiday Park, and so we were able to do things outside. Because when you started, I think the first one you did was in what, August of 2020?
Yeah, August of 2020.
Yeah, so fun times. So as you went through the process, I'm wondering, how did your thinking change? You know, what did you discover as you did this? And
so there's a lot of things, actually. I didn't really fully understand the project I was getting into at the time. I think I had a rough idea, and, you know, I had a direction I wanted to take it, but just like after interviewing each person that was in this project, it kind of added different layers and took this project into like its different directions, and this final product came out actually more amazing than I could have imagined. And I think, you know, just like starting from the first time talking to you know, who I interviewed in August 20th 2020 till the end, like I became more comfortable having the conversations, as well as just hearing a lot of the same echoes about people's experiences with the COVID-19 parallel and HIV at the time, especially with people that were around for both kind of both epidemics or pandemics. We had this conversation. And so just how that impacted them, the loss of life, I think that's something that when HIV, was becoming in the spotlight, and we didn't really fully understand the disease and the side effects, and people's friends getting sick and they don't know why, doctors can't figure it out, or doctors' reactions to when they find are HIV positive, right? How their family responded to them. And I think it was just really enlightening to see that, like, although those things happen, like, history in some ways did repeat itself, and people reacted the same way. Even when someone was, at one point COVID-19 response, like, positive, it was that thing of like, oh, you messed up, you were irresponsible. And then the later we got into the pandemic, and the later, we interviewed people, it was kind of just like, oh, who hasn't had COVID-19 at this point? Like, someone knows someone that got sick, and then when we first started this project, there was no vaccine. And then as we moved through this project, there was a vaccine. So I think it was just interesting kind of seeing the, like, climate of that, and who was willing to take the vaccine, who was not, and their thoughts around that, and just kind of comparing that back to HIV.
Yeah. I mean, the parallels are undeniable. Trying to make sure we have our technical in line here. I'm not sure why we're having little flashes here, but so one of the things that strikes me about it, I was really excited to see a couple of our people actually allowed you went to their homes, right?
Yeah.
So what was that like for you? And kind of getting into someone's personal space.
So it was a privilege, definitely. I think as being like a medical student and like being in the hospital, a lot of these patients that you meet, or like family members that come with patients, you only meet them in the hospital, right? You meet them or out in like a patient clinic. I think that, privilege and intimacy to be able to go into someone's house, like, I think it shows like a level like vulnerability that, especially even during a pandemic, which is like another level of fear, to allow someone to kind of show like, hey, this is me, this is like my home, and I'm going to be vulnerable and tell you what's going on and share my personal experiences and traumas and, my fears. And I think that was definitely a huge privilege. And for the people that I wasn't able to go to their home, I also completely understood that too, because we were living in a pandemic and there's fear of COVID-19, as well as bringing someone in that's a stranger, at this point. You knew these people, but to me and to them, I was a complete stranger, coming in to, like, asking to come into their house and shine a spotlight on their life. And so I completely understand, and I respected that as well. So, we tried to find a place that was neutral, that kind of they felt comfortable with. So a lot of these places were parks and places that people felt, represented them in one way or another. Like in Anthony's case, he would go to this park for a walk, right? And then the park right outside the World Days Museum as well.
Yeah. No, that's a really cool thing. I think one of the things that's striking to me. Well, I want to ask you before I tell you what I think.
Okay.
So when you look at these now, especially because it's been a while, we were able to send. Parvir was in school all this time, right? So this is Parvir's first in-person seeing the exhibit. As you look at this visually now, what do you make of it? Like, what do you come away with as the artist? Of you selected the poses to use and to put in. What do you think is going on with that?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think. Just like when I look at, I think as a photographer, you try to capture your vision, but it's also the subject you're working with. And I think for each one of these people, my biggest goal was to allow some of their personality to shine through, or like, what mattered most to them in their life, or they wanted to be silly, And so I think it's just like really beautiful to see that I think I was able to capture that by looking at these pictures, like the smiles on their faces or the poses. And I think that's just like it's always satisfying to see that as your final product.
Yeah, I really feel like knowing the people as I do, I really can see how they came out. like how I can see their personalities. I know them. I know, yeah, that's what they're like. Like that's. I'm not surprised to see Waldeline looking that way, or Anthony making a face, or it's one of the nice things about the exhibit is you really kind of capture that kind of thing. And I think that was one of the things that was striking to me about it is that a lot of people that have come through the exhibit spend a lot of time looking at this. And they actually, I know that we were working on the conceptualization of it, about how to display it. We had questions about, these are the transcripts of the interviews that Parvir did with the people, and the questions that they answered. And we were wondering whether people would take the time to really read it. And it appeared that is exactly what happened, is that they did stop and really, they were drawn to this, which mission accomplished.
Definitely. And I think, like, Andy said, like, we had, I, in addition to taking photos of all the volunteers, we did at least 30 to 1 hour interview, and we had to take all that, transcribe it into this giant document, and then from there really pick what we felt like reflected their personality or got a message from their perspective across that either resonated or maybe didn't resonate with the rest of the group, to just show different perspectives. And I think that was one of the biggest challenges, in addition to like the pictures, was just like picking what messages to put out, because everything, like, there's plenty options. Right. And to pick from those to like what we think we can put on one page to capture the attention of people visiting. So I'm glad that people were stopping and reading and not just skimming the bolts.
Yeah. So we were the bold. It's hard to see on the tape, but some of the things are put in bold to kind of try to draw people's attention into it. So one of the groups that we had that came in through the entire fall semester was a third year clinical practice class out of optometry at Nova.
Okay.
So the students came in small groups, sometimes just 2 or 3, sometimes more. I had one really big group at the end, that were the last minute holdouts that hadn't done the assignment yet. But they came, and so I think that was really cool for them to see a fellow medical student doing something creative like this. And something that really kind of gets at some of the empathy pieces about this. So, kind of the professionally, I'm just kind of wondering, what have you seen in your medical training thus far around HIV and AIDS? Do you feel like you've gotten good information, or like, how has that been? And does this have any impact, having done this? Does it make you think, I wonder why maybe we should have talked more about that? Or what are your thoughts on that?
I think, and definitely when it comes to HIV and AIDS, it really just humanizes the whole medical process. Just being someone in medical school, you're taught to think very logically, and have empathy for patients. But when you see someone in the hospital, there's like a limited amount of time before you have to move on to see the next patient. And sometimes we're like chasing lab values when we're like, oh, what's his CD4 count, and do we need to put him on prophylaxis for these different things based off the CD4 count, right? So I think it's nice to do this project in the sense of for people in the HIV community and AIDS community, because it humanizes. When I see a patient now, I think of all the people that I volunteered, right? Their stories and what we have to learn from them, like as students and as professionals too, right? I think people and the stories and experiences, like I wasn't around when HIV first began, and I learned more talking to a lot of these people about their experiences and friends passing away, and putting into context these fungal infections and drug names and finding regimens and things like that. So I think definitely for this project, but I think overall as well. It just reminds you, like when you're kind of going through your career or like going through life, that like, everyone has a story and like comes from a different place and has like, all their experiences that led them to who they are today.
Yeah.
Right. And I think even if that, you can like channel that for every person you see for like a couple of seconds to remind yourself to like engage that. I think it's like a valuable teaching tool, and especially in medicine where things are rapidly moving, to kind of just stop and just go in and sit with a patient, just have a small conversation, sometimes not even about the medicine, just about their life. What do they have plans for the weekend? I think just humanizing people to beyond what it's, instead of saying like, HIV positive John, like John living with HIV. Right. Like just the context of that.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think again, what's interesting about this is you have the 4 different poses kind of thing, and if you think about most interactions with patients, even if it's an ambulatory kind of thing, where you would see somebody like maybe for a well visit or something, or it's just a physical or something like that, you kind of only have like one pose that you get, and this kind of shows this other piece to it, and even the selection, I think it's interesting of what they wore.
Yeah.
And to be in the shoot, and just thinking about having all that additional information clinically and kind of what you do with that.
I think
you see it.
I think it's just like seeing people kind of like, I think in the hospital, at least from what I'm going to be doing, like obviously seeing a lot of people in the hospital, and you see people when they're sick. You see them, if they're being admitted to the hospital, there's usually something that's going on. You're not seeing them at their best, right? And I think, seeing people out in the world, in their homes, dressed up how they want to instead of in a gown, like it kind of reminds you like these people have something beyond this, right? Like they're fighting for something, they're trying to get out, they're recovering, like everyone has their reasons. And so I don't know if that's entirely making sense, but it's basically like, I think it reminds you that these patients that you see in the hospital have a life outside that they're trying to get to, even though right now, they're sick and they may not look like it, and it might be easy to blame them. Right. I think that's something that happens a lot of times, is that it's like, oh, well, you weren't taking your medications, or like, you should have been, like, life happens. And these people also they don't want to be there, and you want them to get better and leave, and you want to see them out in society, choosing what they want to wear, interacting with people, living their life.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. No, I think, I think we all kind of struggle with that idea that sickness is, sometimes there's a whole theory, I think, in medical sociology about sickness as deviance. That when someone gets sick, they're being deviant in a way, and I think we carry that around a lot, and we're kind of sold this idea, so that patients, in my experience in working in the emergency department, for example, patients come in with an expectation, and they have something that they want to see happen based on that, and you may not know what that is when you're talking to them.
Definitely.
So in that whole experience, there's like this presentation that they do of themselves to try to meet that goal. So I gotta be sick enough, but I have to also appear like I want to do something about it.
Yeah, and that's kind of, I think, I was like jumbling my words, but I think you captured that really well, in the sense that, there's, both sides to it, right? And I think it's very easy to look at someone, like I said, and be like, HIV positive patient in bed 17, right? Instead of saying like John Williams, who, doesn't have a car and wasn't able to like get to the clinic to get his meds.
Right.
It's easy to be like, patient 17 is non-compliant,
Mm-hmm.
right? Or, I mean, one of the other things is just like the mental health and like the other aspect that a lot of these people are fighting in addition to the stigma of HIV, right? It's just like, I think we forget that as well. And we tell them like, hey, you know, you have hypertension, diabetes, HIV, like you need to lose weight, take blood pressure medications. And it's like, yes, but there's also this other issue that we may not be addressing, which is their mental health and helping them achieve those other goals that we need to.
Right.
So I think seeing people talk about their experiences, like the trauma that they live with, right? Even though it's not like a consult or anything, this whole project, but in that sense, it kind of reminds you that, you know, there's more than that meets the eye when you see people. You know, they're more than their diagnosis is. Yeah, especially in the medical community.
Right, absolutely. No, I think that that's another interesting thing about the 5 people that participated in this, is that they have varying lengths of how long that they've been living with HIV. And so you have people that are relatively newer to it than people that have been here since the 80s dealing with this, and other people that found out maybe in the last 10 years.
Definitely.
And kind of having a different experience. I think that's one of the things that we really try to do here at the museum, is to try to help people to understand the impact that HIV and AIDS has had on society in general, and specifically in some instances around medical care.
Definitely.
So you think about some people first language, for example, that I think is taught in medical school about, you know, that it's a person and not a disease that you're dealing with. And so, and saying, you know, this is a person living with HIV, as opposed to back in the very beginning, people used to say AIDS victim. Wow. You know, it's like, that's just so damaging.
Definitely.
And kind of in there, but we just didn't think about it. In those days. And I think that this whole thing of what the impact of that label is, and then thinking about how does each individual person who's living with HIV think about what that means to them. And so I think what is great about this is this combination of hearing their thoughts as well as just seeing what it looks like.
Definitely.
That people aren't, you know, when any kind of a chronic disease that folks have, it becomes second nature.
Yeah.
You know, and putting it into its proper, it's hard to find the place to put it in its proper perspective.
Definitely. I agree. And I think just also like over time, I think the progress like medically as well as like, you know, advocating and like helping get rid of that stigma has done for just HIV and AIDS in general has been huge. And just even talking to some of the people that, again, you know, were around before a lot of medical advancements were made, were telling us like the just like the medication regimen, how it's changed. And I mean, even talking to patients outside the hospital that like have been recently diagnosed in like the past 5 years, like to them it's not as big of a deal,
right? And
it just like the perception of it's changed, of like, you know, I think seeing so many of your friends go through this in the beginning when HIV was really stigmatized, and losing a lot of people you know to diseases and being scared to, you know, this almost becoming, like you said, like a chronic like disease that you're taking your medications and following your outpatient clinic, you know, and there's a lot of support system, especially in Florida. And so I think this museum does an amazing job kind of capturing that transition and that progress that has been made in HIV and AIDS.
Yeah. Well, that's what we're here to do, and just to show the not consequences, but the benefits of that. The benefits of that. Yeah. But so tell us about what's next for you.
So
you're finishing up.
Yeah. So I graduate in about a month and a half from medical school. I applied for residency. I actually find out in 2 weeks where I'll be going. So I interviewed and I kind of put in my preference, and the place I interviewed put in preference for their candidates. And this system just matches us up, and we find out in 2 weeks, like we open an envelope and it's like, here's where you're going for the next 3 years.
Wow.
And so that's what's next. And I think that's, in terms of medically, that's what's next. I think from an art point, I think I'm going to continue trying to create projects like this. Just trying to highlight and combine that storytelling of medical education, but as well as connecting with the community and seeing what's going on there, and getting, like, you know, whether it's, I already have a couple ideas rolling, but like just like right now is one's like access to medical care, and just like I think talking to people about that and the like barriers that we have, and just so those are kind of the ideas that are flowing through my head.
Makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, I always want to, you know, this has always been something I wanted to continue doing, and I'm going to keep pursuing it and hopefully keep that alive.
Yeah. Well, that's great. So the way we usually wrap up our time together is to talk about stuff outside of your professional life and kind of what do you do now. I know you have been a very, very busy man. So what do you do to relax and like recharge? What is it that makes it possible to keep going, you know, and
I
in the
mean,
downtime?
That's like the boring answer is just sometimes like zonking out in front of my TV and just watching something, whether it's like Friends or like Seinfeld's now on Netflix, so I've been rewatching that. But also, like, I think I need some sort of creative outlet where I'm not really looking to make any final product to put out to the world just for myself.
Right.
And like to share with my friends. So like I was showing you earlier, I've been getting into a little bit more of digital art and trying to learn the ropes of that with no expectations, just seeing what happens there.
Oh, okay.
And then just like being with like my friends and family and trying to be explore outdoors as much as I can. Florida's harder, but originally in California, I'd always like try to go on hikes and, you know, like go to the beach, which I do here. That's amazing too. So just those things in general.
Okay.
Yeah, keep myself busy.
There you go.
Try to be more than just a medical student.
yeah. Well, I forget. Did you go straight through?
No, I took a year off actually.
You were a year off from undergrad to medical school.
I actually taught human physiology and actually worked a little bit at Gilead.
Oh, did you?
Yeah.
Wow. Okay.
I worked on just like helping kind of keep track of like clinical stage 4.
Okay.
Like once these drugs were out in the market, kind of compiling like the adverse effects from like different outlets and like kind of compiling that. So I did that as well as traveled. Once I found out I got into medical school and had enough money saved to travel.
Oh, well, that's very cool.
Took some time off, went to Spain, India. So.
All right.
Yeah.
Wow. What a great gift that was.
Definitely.
Given how I know. Believe me, folks, this guy has been so busy. So, well, we'll go ahead and wrap up for today. But thank you so much for creating this. As I said, I really think that the folks here at the museum got a lot out of it. The visitors who came to the museum, and I'm looking forward to being able to digitize this and have it available to people to enjoy in perpetuity.
I know, absolutely. And thank you so much for just like, you know, working with me. I think when I came to Andy, it was like this fragmented idea that I was like trying to put together.
Right.
And he really helped kind of guide and steer me along and, you know, gave me a shot at this as well as like helping me reach out to the community. And I think this wouldn't have been possible without your guys' help. So I really appreciate it. And I'm honestly just really glad we were able to make it happen.
Me too.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you. And we'll look forward to hearing about your further adventures.
Sounds good, Andy.
All right. Thank you.
Take care, guys. Oh, did it pause?